Hildy is a bawdy, chain-smoking, 70-something former journalist who lives on the Upper West Side in an apartment that has a portal back to 1973. Time travel has rules, though, and Hildy breaks them by traveling back with healthcare aide Trista. Now both women will have to come to terms with their pasts before they lose their chance at having a future. From Ahoy Comics comes Elisa Whitney's Guilt. That's Gilt, a comic book that's Sex and the City meets the Golden Girls by way of the Twilight Zone. Call your local comic book store and ask them to order your copy of Guilt today.
Welcome to Endless, a Sandman podcast from Chipperish Media. I'm writer, erstwhile DC Comics editor, and sightseeing ghost Elisa Whitney.
And I'm story expert and new bug Lonnie Diane Rich. Today on Endless, we're going to be talking about Season of Mist, Chapter 4, Issue 25 from the Sandman comic book series.
Season of Mist, Chapter 4 was written by Neil Gaiman, penciled by Matt Wagner, inked by Malcolm Jones III, colored by Daniel Vazzo, and lettered by Todd Klein. This issue was edited by Karen Berger, assisted by Tom Peyer. Cover by Dave McKean.
Do you want to be a ghost in an attic all your life? Time to wake up. In Season of Mist, Chapter 4, it's December 1990, and a young boy named Charles Rowland wakes up in an attic room as another young boy named Payne tends to him. We go back in time 1 week to see that Charles is staying on at his school, St. Hilarions, over the holidays. It's just him, the headmaster, and the school nurse, Miss Gribble. Charles is staying at school because his father is an architect in Kuwait who's been taken hostage and couldn't send for Charles. As Charles sleeps alone in the dormitory, he feels the presence of the other children, now long dead, who went there in the past. In the present moment, Charles, who is clearly very ill, talks to Payne and says he's not afraid of dying. Payne says he should be. Back to last Tuesday. Charles wakes up, but no one's around. He gets some cookies from his locker and eats them, then goes to the headmaster's office to discover the headmaster's mother is visiting. From hell. She tells some very disturbing stories about Theodore's father, and Charles books it out of there. He goes to the sanatorium and finds Miss Gribble there, holding her 2 dead babies. Charles runs back to the dormitory and falls asleep, eventually. In the present moment, Payne tells the story of his death at the hands of other boys. Payne's bones are still in the attic room. Wednesday. Charles wakes up to find Barrow, Cheeseman, and Skinner, the boys who killed Payne, now threatening him. But the headmaster from 1916 steps in and sends them to the main hall for an assembly. Everyone is dead except for Charles. It's a little awkward. Later that night, the evil dead boys come to get Charles and torture him. Charles passes out and the boys leave, disappointed. That was hardly any fun at all. Payne finds Charles and takes him up to the attic, where Charles lingers for a few days, then wakes up and the timelines catch up. Then Charles dies. Death tries to take him away, but Charles won't go without Payne. Death says she can't take Payne. She already took him, but Charles won't budge. She says fine, she'll come back for him later. Things are kind of nuts now, and she just doesn't have the time. Charles leads Payne out of the school, past a few horrifying scenes of Evil Dead antics, and they leave, figuring they've learned everything they're going to learn there. They want to head down the road and see what life has for them. To be continued. All right, Elisa, here we are, Season of Mist, Chapter 4, in which the dead return and Charles Rowland continues his education. What'd you think?
Oh, gosh. Well, this may be one of my all-time favorite Sandman stories. If favorite means, it yanked my heart out of my body and poured, bitter tears over it and then put it back fuller and richer than it had been before.
Favorite can absolutely mean that.
It is definitely a horror story in part, but it's horror for me that hits much closer to home. I've never been to a British boarding school, but I was sent to summer camp for, I think, 5 summers of childhood, and I was profoundly unpopular. And so I definitely can relate to so many things in this. I think that I remember Neil once saying after Harry Potter came out that he could never have written it because he, had been to a British boarding school, and given the choice, he would have absolutely chosen to remain in the cupboard under the stairs.
Oh, no.
I can so relate to that.
Hmm.
Harry Potter and Harry Potter and this story, they have a context in England, and it's this sort of tradition of boarding school stories. And when I
Hmm.
was 9, I was visiting Israel with my mom, and we went into a secondhand bookstore, and there were a lot of British books. And I found
Hmm.
Enid Blyton's Mallory Towers. So I bought a whole bunch of them. I was desperate for
Hmm.
books, the way kids were desperate for books back when,
Yes.
the TV was all in Hebrew
Back
and
when smartphones were books.
yes.
Yes.
So and it was all about this boarding school where,
Hmm.
selfish people learn to be generous and the clever and the athletic learn to be more empathic, and
Hmm.
nervous people learn to be bold and take chances. And I loved that whole fantasy. Except, I
Hmm.
knew that the reality of any time I was in a place where the children were not as closely supervised, it turned into Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, I think that there is, like so many things in storytelling, there is the kind of storytelling ideal of what that experience would be like for people who hadn't been through it. And then there is the actual reality of an experience, which is never as exciting as the fantasy, version, which is really fun. I have to say, I think this is probably the grimmest and most disturbing issue since 24 hours, the collectors. I think it's up there for me with those two.
Yeah.
It's good. Like, it's a really good story. It's just grim. And I have this thing with dead kids. It's very funny because, like, my boyfriend, I'm always like, okay, I just don't like stories with dead kids. And he, of course, suggested that we watch Stephen King's It. And I was like, I'm not so like every movie he recommends has a dead kid in it, whether he realizes it or not. He's just not as sensitive to it or whatever. But it was so funny because he was like, yeah, there's like kids who get hurt in it, but there's no dead kids. And I was like, it is nothing but it is dead kids central. Spoilers for people who haven't seen Stephen King's It. Anyway, long story short, it's just like something that has always bothered me. I have a problem with kids in danger. I have a problem with kids who are unprotected. And it's just a me thing. Like, it's just one of my personal things that like gets me. But this story is completely solid. It's really well told. It's very interesting. It's totally engaging. It just is like difficult for me to engage with, but I found that actually with a lot of Sandman have had these little challenges along the way. And at the same time, I've really enjoyed kind of getting past them and into this story. And what's funny is that when I read this, I was like, oh, okay, so we're in this short story space, right? We're like looking at this world from a different angle. And this is the thing, like with Sandman, we get these multifaceted spaces, right? We're in the same world, we're watching the same events, as this stuff is unfolding, but we'll see it from all these different perspectives, which can be really, really fun. And so here we are seeing it from this perspective. And I was like, oh, that was really neat. How interesting. Now these two dead boys are going to wander around and they're just going to be out there in the world. And then at the bottom it says to be continued. And I'm like, oh, wait, is there more of, Charles Roland and Dead Boy Payne? So I thought that was really interesting, and I'm very intrigued in seeing where the rest of I think of it as seasons, this volume goes, which I think is going to be really, really interesting. It's always a surprise, I gotta say. Sandman never goes where I think it's going to go. It's always interesting. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this cover art. Once again, we have Dave McKean. We get this sort of Brady Bunch grid, the same picture of a young, smiling boy who looks blonde to me. So it would seem to me that it's Payne and not Charles, but I'm not really sure. But in the grid, what I find so interesting here is the image is seen through it's like varying flickers of flame. We only see it through the shape of the flame. And there are these shifting colors, the purple, red, blue, green. We go from these hot colors, these warm colors, colors to the cool colors and then back up again. And the picture of the boy is the same, but the colors and the shape of the flame shift. So it feels like time is moving and yet also stuck, which is sort of the sense of the dead, right? Your Pain was dead, I don't know how long ago, but he's still a little boy. And the background has this dark, very 90s grungy blue texture, which I thought was really cool. So this is a really interesting cover. What did you take from it?
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure if the boy was blonde or if the film was like an old reel of film that gets partially overexposed or burnt in a fire. And I felt there was a little bit of a sense that there's this child frozen in a moment that's been extended, the way when you look at the cells of a reel of film. And, with the flicker of color, I kind of imagined it as a life emerging from this bruised purpley blue shadow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But no, I thought this was a moving cover, and I like that, like Sandman, Dave goes in unexpected ways.
He does, and he goes so deep. There's always like this deeper meaning if you actually sit and think about it, and I really enjoy that. We also have a new artist working on the thing. We've brought in Matt Wagner.
Yeah, so Matt Wagner is actually known as a comic book writer as well as an artist. I believe he won the Eisner, which is comics top award, for his writing on Grendel, and he's been nominated for the Eisner for both his writing and his art. He went on to write a Vertigo comic book, Sandman Mystery Theater, that was based on the Golden Age Sandman. And yeah, so he's obviously multi-talented. I felt that his style, which has this graphic, at times a little cartoony, slightly abstract quality to it, keeps the balance of this story, which can skew pretty dark, on the side of humor and poignancy rather than outright horror. And yet, Scott McCloud, who's written the books Making Comics and Understanding Comics, he's got this whole bit that he talks about where when you abstract a face, it becomes more universal. And when you have a hyper-realistic face and it's more specific, then you see an individual. And so there is something about I'm calling it cartooniness for want of a better word, but there is something about that slight abstract a graphic quality that I get from this that feels like it makes this story a little hit home in a different way. I know that I am neither, Charles Rowland or Edwin Payne, but I feel myself in both of them very strongly because they are stylized.
It's so interesting because, again, like as I've said before, I'm learning so much about comics because there's so much I knew nothing, right? But Scott McCloud, I did undergraduate work in television, and one of the books they had us read was Scott McCloud because when you're talking about a visual medium, even though it's comic books versus film or whatever, there are some universal parts of that visual language that you can go to, and I hadn't really thought about. And again, I don't want cartoonish is used as a word that is like in a derogatory way because there's almost nothing those of us who speak the English language cannot make derogatory in one way or another. But without saying that in a derogatory way, that it is very drawn. And it is, and we do have these, kind of like the facial features are not terribly distinct. And so it does make you feel like that could be you, even though it's a little boy in a boarding school in England. And the ability to do that within, a story like this, I think is a really interesting use of that skill set. Like to make that happen. I think that's really cool. So, okay, I'm just going to come out. This is so grim. This story is so grim, but so interesting. And it had me thinking so many thoughts. Because like we have hell is closed, right? Heaven, we can presume, is still business as usual. right? Why are babies coming back from hell? Because they weren't baptized? Is that what we're supposed to believe? Like, it's not the writing. Again, it's the belief system. Like, I've heard these stories of like babies must be baptized, or if they die, they're going to go to hell. And here we have this baby who died in utero with a mother who had German measles and was 16 years old, and that baby comes back from hell. Like, that is crazy pants. All of that just sounds insane to me. Pain was a child murdered by people trying to raise demons. How was he in hell? What could he possibly have done in those 13 years of life that he had that sent him to hell? So I find this whole thing like it's so powerful and interesting, but I'm like, does everybody go to hell? Like, I mean, I don't know.
You know, it's funny, in my notes, I wanted to mention that in Judaism, Gehenna is, I think, a place where the soul gets cleansed more. There is, again, this is not my area of expertise. I do believe that in Judaism, there's this idea that the soul is composed of different parts. There's like the animal soul, there's the individual personality, and then there is this like kernel of immortality that's in there, and that, you know, the stuff that's particular to you gets stripped away, and you've got this pure essential soul that remains. But I thought, you know what, let me just take all this away and just talk about the cosmology, or the philosophy of the Sandman. I think there was a book published, like the physics of the Buffyverse. Maybe, you know, someone needs to do a book like the cosmology and the role of hell in Sandman comics. I think there is an argument to be made that hell must have very different areas and corridors, and not all of it is about punishment, that some of it is about where you are stuck. And I get the feeling, you know, that Pain went to hell because he was mentally stuck. He'd been tortured, and he was still caught in, you know, in that awful moment. He couldn't get out of it. And then it takes him having a friend who says, we don't have to be stuck here. I don't think hell is a place. And that his belief that hell is not a place is part of what gets them out of the attic. And, you know, I'm skipping to the end here, but, you know, Pain says, my bones are here. And, you know, and Roland says, and mine, and my hair, and a bit of skin too, but I don't see why that should stop me. And then it's like, oh, okay. So it's perhaps this idea that what we believe is what limits us or confines us.
Interesting.
But then I have this thought about the never born. I wonder if then are the never born constrained by the belief systems of the parent?
Yeah. I mean, maybe. I don't know. It's really interesting. And then we have Death, right? So Death comes in. She comes for Charles, right? But I mean, okay, but Pain came back though because hell was closed. So he was, I don't know, the whole thing I find so incredibly confusing.
But what I'm saying is, my hypothesis is that Pain was in hell, and we don't know where he was in hell or how, you know, obviously hell was not fun for him, but that his hell was being stuck in a place, somehow being stuck in his conception of what was going to happen to him, that he was trapped in his 13-year-old sense of, I got murdered, so I'm going to go to hell. And that
when you're 13 years old, you could still believe that, you know, that because, let's say, perhaps you did the things that 13-year-old boys are well known for doing, that you may think you belong in hell. And we did have that bit of world building with Lucifer, where he's like, they come here and they tell us what they want and we do it, but it's got nothing to do with me. So maybe it's just, you know, people who believe, even if it's erroneous. And as a kid, you don't know. You don't know if what you've done is bad enough to go to hell. There are a lot of things that people say will send you to hell that if as you grow up, you're like, well, that's ridiculous. But when you're a kid, you know.
And I just want to say that there is no place in hell that I can imagine that would be worse than this boarding school, or than, some of my, just being a kid, being so powerless. My mom, I remember, always said, everyone wants to go and be a child again. She said, I hated it. I hated it. You have no agency. You're powerless to, to determine your own fate. And so that's, so I don't know. This seems like a pretty hellish, the escape from hell is hellish.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really, it's so interesting. But Death comes for Charles and says, no, I already came for Pain. So does that mean that Death is escorting children to hell? Like, or what? She's just, it doesn't matter where they're going. She's just moving them along on the conveyor belt.
So I think that Death is both. So there's a term, psychopomp. If I'm using this right, this is a long time since I looked this up. But a psychopomp is a character who helps escort you through the transition, like Sharon the ferryman.
Yeah.
And so I think in this sense, Death is also a psychopomp in that she is helping you bridge that transition between and
where you go,
your life, and where you go next. I think that there is a suggestion here that where you end up, just like the Sorting Hat in Harry Potter, that if you're thinking like, not Slytherin, that you don't end up in Slytherin. And if you're thinking, I guess, God, I hate this, but I guess I deserve to be in Slytherin. I feel like I'm Slytherin bashing. I'm sorry. There are plenty of good people who've gone to Slytherin, I'm sure.
Yes.
So, but I think that there is that element of we become the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves.
Yeah.
I just want to say a side note. I had this as a note in the script to say later, but here we've got Death visually. She is so 80s. She's got the sweatband. Yeah. She looks like Olivia Newton-John in that Physical video. And it's because obviously she's jogging all over the place. She's wearing, I think, leg warmers and what are clearly Reebok sneakers, if anyone remembers those. But in the script, Neil describes her as, just not making an effort. She is cool because she doesn't try to be cool. Yeah. He says, she's running around, but if I were to go jogging, I would just wear a black t-shirt and jeans. So maybe that's what she's wearing. And Matt Wagner went another way. I suspect in the Netflix series, she is not going to be dressed like that. But
like Olivia Newton-John?
What?
Yes.
I don't know.
Even when she's incredibly busy, she still has style. And I got to say, I respect it. I definitely respect it. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's really funny that, we have Death showing up, right? And she's like, all right, kid, look, you don't want to go? Fine. You stay here. I got stuff to do. But I'm like, why is she busier? Because the dead came back, but she's not reprocessing the dead who have returned because she's not at all interested in Pain. She's like, I already worked, he's already checked off on my list. Not my problem, right? Not my circus, not my monkeys. So why is Death so harried now? Except for all the people that the dead are killing.
That's what I'm thinking. Because I had thought initially that she had to round up the escapee dead.
Had to reprocess them.
Yes,
right.
But if she's not doing that, or maybe the priority is people who are dying for the first time. But this really, it does seem an inefficient, Death needs some bureaucratic help.
She needs a personal assistant at the very least. I mean, my God.
Now that would be an interesting story, Death's personal assistant.
Death's personal assistant would actually be really, really interesting. We should definitely talk about that later. But anyway, so this story, we've got kind of this, there's so much. I'm sorry.
I just had this thought. It's a choice.
That's okay.
It's a choice. Because like Dream has used his power to create the dreaming and to invite denizens in, to have people who've died while asleep and dreaming to have the choice to remain. He has, given Cain this lease. He's made a decision to people his realm. I guess Death did not make that decision because we never hear about her having used part of her power to create, helpers the way Dream
Mm-hmm.
has, or to invite people into the realm of death. Um,
Interesting.
so for all
She just
that
does it all on her own.
but that must be a choice. I'm sorry, like I didn't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt, but it was suddenly like brain
No,
exploding.
but that's a really interesting idea. I'm glad that you did interrupt. I think that that's a really interesting idea. That she could. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Dream seems all, brooding solitary pants, but he's chosen. He's not so introvert as he makes himself out to be.
He has absolutely created community in the dreaming. Now, again, the dreaming is a realm, right? And death is a transition.
Oh, but
So
doesn't she
maybe
have a
it's
realm?
because,
I mean,
does she have a realm? I mean, there's heaven and there's hell. What is she? She is the ferryman. She is the transition. She is the person who takes you from one place to another. Does she have a place, a realm? Is there a place? Where would she put all of her little denizens if she has no realm?
okay, I'm very excited to have these questions be out there, but I want to make sure we talk more about the issue because now we're deep in the
Yes.
cosmology of
We're
Sandman.
getting deep into the cosmology. I think that that's interesting. We'll go ahead and set that aside for the moment. And let's talk a little bit about the visual storytelling, the things that we're able to do in comics. We had a little bit of a play with some dramatic irony here, and I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, this is one of those parts that I really love in this. And I
Mm-hmm.
go back and forth between writing prose and writing comics. In comics, in books, especially in romantic books and YA, there's been this trend towards very deep POV. And in
Mm-hmm.
comics, because it's visual, there are some things that are possible that aren't so easily possible in prose.
Mm-hmm.
So the scene I'm thinking about is I'm going to just read out the description of page
Okay.
6, panel 4. This is from the script. Okay, like the last shot, only pull back further so the door is smaller. And staring at where Roland just went are figures in the mist, little more than outlines. 4 or 5 boys with blank faces staring from the fog at the door the living boy went through, staring expressionlessly at the door or at us, depending on how you want to frame it. Basically, this is the first moment in the ghost story we can be certain there's something wrong, and we know before Roland does. Basically, this page should just be black and white, the white of the mists, the black of the things coming out of it. And then we have the captions, of the letter that
Mm-hmm.
Roland's writing, please, Daddy, take me home. And I just think there's something so wonderfully chilling. It is such a ghost
Mm-hmm.
story moment. And
Yeah.
it's very visual.
Mm-hmm. It is. I mean, and it's such I remember that moment, the way it was expressed in the visuals, and it really is just this breath of like, oh man, there's something. And of course, we've known like the dead are coming back, the dead are coming back is something that we have been hearing, a refrain we've been hearing for the last couple of issues. And here is where we just first begin to see that. So this being presented in this classic ghost story fashion, I think is pretty much perfect. It's just a perfect setting for this.
It is. We see the implications, but it's also, I think, a good moment to call out for readers who are new to reading comics because in the audio Sandman book everything will get called out more specifically. Here you
Mm-hmm.
have to attend to the artwork. If you're just reading the text, you won't see those ghosts. And if your eye is skimming over the picture, we learn to
Mm-hmm.
dismiss pictures. So you could just say, okay, I'm going to keep my eye on Charles and I'm going to, just take in and I'll flip through really quickly. You've got to slow down and pay attention. And it's a different kind of close reading. We may know how to close read poetry or texts. This requires close reading so you don't miss it. If it were a TV show or a movie, I'm sure in the Netflix series, it's going to be a special effect, right? We're going to see the mist, and
Mm-hmm.
at first it'll just be mist, and then it will cohere into these boys' shapes. I'm imagining something like that. Whereas here, it's a little more abstract, and you've got to do a little more visual work, a little more reader work.
You do. You have to lean in with comics. This is the thing that I've learned because I am very much a read the text on the page, and then the pictures are just there to support, the text. That like I don't need it. And it's one of those things while doing, these reads that I'm like, okay, we've got to pay attention to all of the visuals and what do they mean and how do they work together and what is happening in the panel and what is happening in the gutter and how do all these things and what does this visual language mean? And it is one of those things where you really do. It's like, mindfulness, right, is this big thing right now. Is that we have to be mindful. We have to be in the moment. We have to actually take the effort involved. It is effort to live in the moment because we live in a world that is so full of distractions, and paying attention is a skill that we, I think, are not as attuned to, right? We've lost a little bit of that. And part of that is because there's so many things that are vying for our attention that to actively give our attention to the little details and to really absorb something is not kind of a natural inclination at this time, in the world, right? In the way that people are existing in the world. And so there is something about reading comics that does make me feel meditative. It makes you, I think it might be good for you. I think reading comics and really paying attention to every little thing, if you can't get into meditation, that might be, an entryway for you.
Oh my God, I love that.
You really do have to stop, and stop rushing through everything. We read everything so fast now that to actually take the time and see all the visuals. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love that this experience has been teaching me to do, because I am a racer. I'm a rusher. Let's get to the next thing. What's next? What's next? What's next? And in comics, you have to be what's here. And really sit in it for a moment. And I think that it does have that mindfulness effect. I think you get benefits from that.
Oh my God, I love that. And I find comics so much easier than meditation.
Right. So maybe it's an entry point, right? If you can't meditate, then just go read a comic. But read it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is that people, when I use the word read, and I'm talking about engaging, thoughtfully with any story in any format. So when you're listening to an audiobook, you are reading the audiobook. When you're watching a movie, you are reading the movie. If you are thinking about what it all means and how it all works together and taking in the visuals and how do the visuals work and what does that give me, So whenever you're engaging thoughtfully with anything, you are reading it. And so when, we talk about reading a comic book, I'm talking about capital R, reading a comic book. That's a whole different experience.
You're eating a lobster, you have to dig into each little, whatever those feelery things are with your special
you have to
tool.
Mean it. Right. Exactly. All right. So let's see what else do we have here. Ooh, there's some discussion to be had about children in adult spaces and the ways we're teaching. You and I both had a bunch of notes about the ways in which we are looking at these kids. First is looking at the kids in adult spaces and that we're using the last names rather than the first names, which I think does something. And also, like you were talking about helicopter and snowplow, the very big appliance, kind of parenting that we've got going on now, and what it used to be like way back in the day when you and I were kids.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what's changed. Mm-hmm. So, people talk about helicopter parents and snowplow parents who try and remove every obstacle. Mm-hmm. Back in, I think the late 60s, early 70s, there was this assumption that children by and large had to shape themselves more to adult spaces. And there was more of this you would be expected to come along sometimes with your parents to adult things, and there would be nothing to freaking entertain you. If you were, 6, 7, 8 years old, nobody was bringing you a bag of toys or a portable. There might not be a TV. You were expected, one crayon, a piece of paper, and you would have to make it last. The other thing, and I saw a discussion about this on Twitter that I thought was really interesting, the idea that before, I guess there were always kids' books, but I don't remember this clear middle grade. There were, early reading books, chapter books, and then whatever the hell you could get your hands on. And
right.
And so, I mean, I was reading Forever Amber and Harold Robbins, porny Hollywood books, Jackie Collins, as well as
Stephen King, yeah,
Shakespeare and classical. You would find a book. I remember at one point reading The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire because, again, I was on a trip in Israel. It was the only book I could find in English, and I was 9.
Yeah,
and they're talking about, degrading currency, and I'm thinking, God, this is boring, but I can't understand the TV. Anyway,
exactly.
But nothing was, mostly kids were allowed to read whatever it is they wanted to read. There wasn't this, I think, same level of concern that they were going to be corrupted by uncomfortable things in books. And so I think we get to see the sense of free range childhood here in good ways and in bad ways. And I love how Roland is, having to entertain himself, and he's entertaining himself with the Scarlet Pimpernel. And, this whole idea, the Scarlet Pimpernel is a classic superhero story, really. He's got a secret identity. He's, hiding his true heroic self under a foppish exterior. So I just love that. And I think Neil had actually written about how he would pretend to have a headache and sneak away into the library at school to escape into books. And I think we, this generation of kids, maybe we didn't get some of the benefits, but we also ended up just stumbling onto weirder stuff that was not intended for us. And there's a certain thrill that goes along with reading stuff that you absolutely know was not intended for you.
Right. It was not age appropriate, I believe is what they call it today. It's really interesting because I think that having access to that kind of stuff, while we protect our kids so much from that stuff now because we feel so damaged by our own childhoods, right? Nobody cared where we were. We wandered around for whatever. And so then the next generation turns around and protects their kids, like maybe a bit too much, and that there's somewhere in there. Usually it's the balance in the middle that is the place to go, But one of the things that I caught was that we're using last names for all of these children, right? And when I was writing the summary, I was like, okay, do I call him Charles or do I call him Roland? And I went through and I did a find and replace, and I put Roland in there, and I was like, no, Roland is an adult, right? This is a child. So I went back and changed it all back to Charles, and I found that I identified and connected with this character so differently based on what he was called and the way that he was addressed. And Payne is we just get his last name, which of course his whole identity is Payne, right? I mean, that is everything he is. He is just a child rendition of the concept of pain. That is who this kid is, And I find it so interesting how that one little switch in the way in which we think about this kid changes the way we see him,
Although, for me, I actually was in Mallorca when I was 3, and I knew a kid named Roland. This is a very strange story. There was a tire swing, and I was the youngest kid. I never got to be on the tire swing. And then suddenly everyone left the tire swing, and I got to be on the tire swing. And I realized everyone else was running around, and I got up and I said, "What's going on?" And someone said, "Roland split his head open against the wall," and he kept on running to the nurse. I realized this can't have happened quite this way, but I was 3. Anyway, so I knew Roland as a first name, and
oh, sure, right.
Roland was one of my 2 imaginary friends.
Well, Roland as a first name is different, right?
Yes.
But when we know it's his last name, and yet we're hearing him addressed by his last name, there is something about children being addressed by their last names, which creates a distance between us and them, which makes us see them as more adult than maybe they are.
I didn't take it that way myself, but I thought that it gave you, nowadays, for me, I mean, but I can see why that could read that way. For me, it's like now that everyone instantly calls everyone by their first name, the intimacy of the first name is lost. But, in romances and historical romances, there's always this moment where it's like, don't call me, Lord Huntley anymore. Call me Brad or whatever it is. And there's that moment when the boys exchange first names and you're like, oh, intimacy.
It is. It's incredibly intimate, but I find it interesting. And then we have these three murdery boys, Barrow, Cheeseman, and Skinner, which sounds like the worst law firm ever. And we have these representatives from Barrow, Cheeseman, and Skinner who are just like murdering people and animals and all of this stuff and killing this kid. And the kid is too. Payne is like, my bones are here. They didn't even try really hard to like make it look like it wasn't a murder. Yeah.
Has your satanic ritual gone wrong? Call Cheeseman, Barrow, and Skinner. We're experts in solving this for you.
It's seriously, I mean, I love it. And if I ever write a story that has a law firm, I'm calling it Cheeseman, Barrow, and Skinner. That's it. But anyway, so yeah, I thought all of this stuff was just so crazy, so weird. These children who are murdering, these children who come back, and then they're like, oh yeah, you're back here because you either had nowhere else to go or you died here. And then we have the stories of the children who died there.
And it is part of what makes this writing so effective for me that even Barrow, Cheeseman, and Skinner, the law firm, Barrow, Cheeseman, and Skinner, even they give you a moment where you have to feel if not empathy, at least compassion, because they died in World War I. And I think in this country, we also seem to forget World War I. World War I, I always felt sad for World War I. World War I was like, we're important too. And all the attention growing up was on World War II. And only now, I think, especially as we're more aware of the aftermath of World War I and the influenza epidemic, I mean, it was a terrible war for young men, and it really destroyed a generation. And so you look at these, little shits. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah. Sure.
But it's
your podcast. You can say whatever the hell you want.
But we have a moment of compassion even for them.
Even for them, yeah, because that was a really, really terrible time. But yeah, it's seeing them also as, Cheeseman, Barrow, and Skinner, and not John, Elliot and Gavin or whatever, like it does something. It creates a separation. And so we have these children where we would care about them if they were children, but because we're talking about them by their last names, because we're putting that distance there, because we're kind of seeing them as adults, it's just a little bit different. And that got me thinking, because I recently read this book. And it's one of these things, somebody reads a book that has philosophy in it and they start talking about all this kind of stuff thinking they know anything. I know nothing. I know very little about philosophy, but I'm going to talk about it as though I do. So I just read this book called How to Be Perfect by Michael Schur, who's the creator of The Good Place. And it's basically a funny philosophy primer, just like the very basics, the low-level philosophy, concepts. But one idea he talked about that stuck with me was this idea of moral desert. And I'm about to butcher all of this philosophy stuff. So if any of you want to correct me, and I know some of you do, it's endless@chipperish.com. Just go ahead and give me an email and tell me all the ways in which I'm wrong. But basically, moral desert is the idea that if you do something good, you deserve some kind of reward for it, which is basically like a goodness cookie, right? You do something good and you get a cookie. But that thinking has flaws to it, because if you're only being good for the cookie, then you're not really being good. And so anyway, like as I'm reading this story about babies and murdered children going to hell, I'm thinking about the fact that I have like a really strong response to children being harmed and being unprotected, but adults like, fuck them, right? Like, this is how we feel about adults. Screw it, whatever. They probably deserve it because once you're past the age of 16, you've done something terrible enough to deserve whatever the hell horrible things happen to you. And when I think about that, I feel like how unreasonable that is, that we feel like once you've, like, you're innocent and lovely and wonderful and a child until you cross this Rubicon, and then suddenly whatever happens to you, you deserve it, you're terrible, go to hell for eternity. Eternity, these people are being tormented. Nada was 16 when she died, and she's been in hell for 10,000 years. Like, it is so unbalanced and so wrong, and all of it, when you think about it, just doesn't make any sense. This idea that anybody, no matter what they've done, would necessarily deserve hell. Like, there's no justice. That's just vengeance, and vengeance doesn't do anything, so anyway, I started thinking about the idea of moral desert, and then we have this kind of flip of it. I don't know what the word for it is, but like, that you deserve whatever bad things happen to you because it's your own damn fault, because you did these things, because you were this or whatever, and I find it so, like, just the idea that anybody, no matter what they've done, I mean, even if you think about the most, like, evil person in the world, does their suffering for an entire eternity really make anything it doesn't undo any of the terrible things that they did, like, so what is it? What is the value of this system? The system doesn't work. This is the bad place.
I think this kind of fits back into our whole cosmology of Sandman. I just keep thinking that, in a way, eternity in this is a shorthand for me. And it's a shorthand for just being stuck. For being stuck. You keep thinking, well, if this person was 16 and they were this person, surely by 36 they'd be that much more advanced, and 56. But we all know people who ceased to grow. And I think, so to me, because I can't really relate to what eternity is or 10,000 years.
Right.
For me, it's a shorthand for people who've gotten stuck.
So you're just getting stuck somewhere. I like that. I mean, that I understand. This idea of people being condemned to an eternity in hell does not make any sense to me. And of course, I think, and there are people, again, endless at chipperish.com. I think there are people who have read the actual, like, source material for the Bible, like the books, understanding it in the context of the language in which it was originally written, and the ways in which we have throughout the years bastardized it and translated it into things that maybe aren't what the original intent was. All of that, I'm sure, is out there. I know I've heard bits and pieces of it, but again, I don't know anything. I don't know enough about it to talk about it. All I know is that when I look at it through the context of these children, when I looked at it through the context of the adults that were in hell, I was like, yeah, well, Brachel Livonia, yeah, sure, deserves it, right? Whatever. But when I look at it through the context of these children, I'm like, wow, it is weird how my response changes so much based on whether they're kids or adults.
But, there's one common thread I see with Brachel of Livonia, if I'm saying that right, yes, and Cheeseman, Barrow, and Skinner. Call now for all your satanic rituals gone awry. But what they have in common is this sense that they get to hell and nobody cares about them.
And nobody cares.
And,
that was a neat little turn.
Did I ever do a thing? Clearly, just people feel really inadequate in hell.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where a lot of us are stuck, in just this constant eternity of inadequacy. All right, so I think that gives us a wonderful segue into Lucien's library. That's actually not a segue. We're not talking about inadequacy in Lucien's library, but I just had to move us into it, so I tried to do it as smoothly as possible. All right, so Lucien's library, behind the scenes, possible spoilers. You have been warned. Elisa, what do you got for us?
So Neil said he set out to write a ghost story that was also a love story, and that was also a real horror story. And I think he absolutely succeeded on all three counts. So at the end of the story, Neil said that he kind of imagined that the boys go off and set up maybe their own occult detective agency. And this idea was actually spun off into a Vertigo comic miniseries, The Dead Boys Detective Agency, written by Ed Brubaker, illustrated by Brian Talbot and Steve Leialoha. Roland and Payne also show up in the TV show Doom Patrol, and I just discovered that there was a pilot commissioned for an HBO show back in 21, thousands of years ago, about the Dead Boys Detective Agency. I have to admit, though, although I love the idea of the boys as, detectives and all of that, the story of them finding each other is a romance or bromance. And even though there's so much fun to be had in the story of their partnership, it just doesn't have the same emotional heft. And it's why, for me, I loved Romancing the Stone, but I really didn't have any interest. What was the one that came after?
Jewel of the Nile.
Jewel of the Nile. I think I saw Jewel of the Nile once, and Romancing the Stone is like an annual rewatch for me.
1,000,000 times.
Yeah.
Well, it's the love story, right? Yeah. And the thing is that when we talk about love stories, we're not necessarily talking about romances. Those are different things, right? But the love story is just two people who love each other and who are connected. And here we have Payne and Roland. And I am astounded, fascinated that there was an HBO show. If it came out, I'll find it. If not, if it's coming out, I will watch it when it comes out. I'm very excited for this idea. And I love these two boys, being bonded by this experience. And also the fact that Roland, who was kind of timid, right, in life, he just kind of was like, okay, I guess this is what's going on. I guess nobody's going to feed me, so I'll just eat some cookies. Oh, okay, there's dead people just doing terrible things to each other all over the place. Okay. And then dies. And once he dies, he has no fucks to give, which I love so much about him, is that once he's at that point, he's like, yeah, my dad, not that interested in being a parent. I'm not really going to worry about him. He clearly was not that worried about me, and he just gets up, goes on the road, is like, so we have to stay here because our bones are here? I don't think so. He stops following their rules. The world has let him down, and he is not about to sit there and just do whatever this world tells him he should do. He gets up and he leaves. And one of the things that I love is that moment at the end when Payne is following him and he takes off his cap and he throws it up in the air and it lands on one of the spikes of the gate, which, by the way, for a boys' school, for a children's place, those are some pretty spiky gates you got there, people,
Britain's a spiky gate kind of place in a lot of ways.
It's a spiky gate kind of place. But it looked like a head on a pike when he tossed that cap up. And I was just like, that is fascinating imagery in so many different levels.
But it also tells us something about the cosmology. And this I am just saying right now off the cuff, that, there's this conceit that ghosts look the age they were when they died, and that they are kind of wedded to whatever they were wearing. If they were wearing a torn wedding gown, that's it. Torn wedding gown, no new clothes for you. And if they were wearing a cap with their uniform, suck it up. You've got
there you go.
And so I think that Roland has become a truly leadership kind of ghost guy, because he is saying, I don't have to stay where my bones are. These are conventions and guidelines, not rules.
Yeah. And go ahead and stop me then, right?
Yeah.
He's going to go. And if he gets pulled back, fine. But he's not going to stay there because he thinks he needs to be there, which is what Payne has done.
He's not going to self-edit. Yeah. No,
He's not going to self-edit.
Absolutely.
It's so beautiful. I love that part of the story. All right. So what else do you have for us behind the scenes in Lucien's library?
Behind the scenes. So we talked a little bit about books. And I just thought that when in the script, Neil mentions some of the books he would go and read when he was faking a headache. Father Brown's Stories, Man-Eaters of the Kumaon, King Solomon's Mines were the ones that were mentioned. So I thought I would say that. I
love it.
Lonnie, what book do you remember reading when you shouldn't have been reading that book at all?
Oh my goodness. I, funny enough, was so into Stephen King when I was very young. I could not get enough of horror stories back then. And so I remember reading all of those. I remember once in the 8th grade, my teacher, and I swear to God, I don't know how this happened, had recommended looking for Mr. Goodbar to me or had said something about it. And I didn't know what it was. I was in 8th grade. And so I went and got it from the library and then I started reading it. I was like, oh, this is sexy. And then I went to him and I was like, oh, hey, so you told me to read this book, but it seems like, did I get the wrong book? And he's like, I never told you to read that book. And I'm like, no, I think you did, because I wouldn't just make it up off the top of my head. So there was stuff like that that I read a lot. But mostly I loved I loved the Brontes and I loved Austen and like all of that kind of stuff when I was a kid. I used to love reading that.
Oh, fun.
Although Jane Eyre is pretty freaking horrifying. You read that as an adult and you're like, oh my God, this is nuts. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Well, I think I was reading a lot of my dad's science fiction, and then I loved me some turgid, late 70s historical fiction, Cleopatra clutching asps to her creamy bosom for all she's worth. Anyway, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the pacing of ghost stories. So Neil, at the beginning of the script, talks a bit about how is he going to fit in everything he needs to and yet take the time that he needs to in the beginning. And he said, with ghost stories, you really need to establish the status quo before you can screw around with it. And so and I was realizing that for me, whether it's disaster movies of the 70s or I don't know, it feels like pacing used to be slow enough to really establish characters and what the status quo was. And now it's feeling like we must grab you by the, short and hairies immediately. And so but the problem is I don't have enough time to invest in anyone before everything becomes craptastic. So yeah. I love the pacing of this.
Yeah, no, I think it's nice. I mean, and the thing is that I would not say in any way that this is paced slowly. We start out with them dead. We do the time jump, right? Where we borrow from later on in the story and then we come back. So we see him dead first, with this other boy with him. And then we go back to a week ago and we kind of walk through that story. So it's not like anybody's taken a lot of time to get to the exciting stuff in this episode or in this issue.
And that's actually a really good point. I was thinking about this and then I forgot it. But, if you want to, if you're, if anyone listening to this is a writer and trying to learn different kinds of structures, this is that beginning in the middle or, right before the crisis. It's beginning, right before the final crisis because this boy is dying, but he's not yet dead. And then we go back to the beginning and flash back until we catch up with the moment he's at. And then where we're at is close to the climax of the story.
Yes.
As we move toward.
And actually, that is something I haven't found like an actual term for it yet. So I just call it the fractured tease, which is where we borrow something from later in the story and do it at the beginning. Typically, I don't like them. And the reason I don't like them is because often they are used very cheaply. Often it's like, the thing that comes to mind is this episode of Leverage from some years ago where we have Hardison who is in a coffin and then we go 36 hours earlier. So we just borrow from an exciting point so that we can kind of like grab people at the beginning, but we're not really using it as something that is thematically what this story is about. And I always hated fractured teases. Then I started watching Breaking Bad where we used fractured teases. I always say we as if I had anything to do with it. I don't know why I do that. I always do that. And it's nothing to do with me whatsoever. So when I say we, tell me to shut up in your head because I always do in my head. Anyway, so in Breaking Bad, Vince Gilligan would take part of the story from the end, but it would be something that was related thematically to it was a thematic moment rather than an exciting moment, And I feel like that's what Neil does here. Like we take this moment, which is really about these two boys, in this space between life and death, where pain really does death's job, right? Pain is there, with Roland the whole time, walking him through this experience. Then Roland dies, and then they're together, and he, helps him through that transition. So pain kind of is death's assistant. I would say, unofficially, in this issue. So this is a ghost story, absolutely. This is a horror story, absolutely. But mostly it's a love story, and we start with the beginning of that love story.
Yeah.
And so I think that thematically, a fractured tease in this circumstance is actually, I think it's good, and I think that it works. Typically don't like them. I don't like them when they're cheaply employed because we just don't feel like we want to make our beginning as entertaining or exciting enough or whatever. Whenever there's something that's like 36 hours earlier, I always get really irritated. But I think that here, because we're talking about a love story and we're starting with what is really important about this and then leading up to it, I think it really works.
Yeah, it's interesting. Could the story also have worked if it just started with this boy in this deserted
Yeah.
in the deserted school? Because I feel, I mean, that is such I think it could have possibly worked the other way as well.
I think it could have worked both ways, but because we start with the most important thing, which is this relationship,
Yes.
right? We're not borrowing from this moment. This is not this big heart pounding, exciting moment. This is a very deeply emotionally connected moment with these two boys, and one is caring for the other, one who is dead, one who is alive. We've got them on two sides of this divide, right? And this is what this story is about, right? The divide between life and death and the transition over. But it's very much about the love story in the
Yes.
middle of all of that horror. And I think that, yes, you absolutely could have told this story. It would have been good, but the point would have maybe been missed, that this is not a horror story. This is a love story, because we're starting with that.
Yes. And I want to say this is one of the stories that I think works better as a comic than it does on the Audible for me, because of there's this moment when, Roland is he's so cold, and he's lying there in the attic, and he holds Payne's hand, and he says, "You're so cold." And Payne says, "Well, something like that's to be expected. It's hardly surprising." And then we get our first full visual of his face, and we see that his eyes are, glazed over with the milk white of death.
Yeah.
That's when that's the penny drop that he's dead. And I don't think
Yeah.
there's something about that reveal that I just find both chilling and cool. And I think it worked better for me in this one instance with the visual.
I think that there are certain things that lend themselves more to one particular kind of storytelling medium than another. There are some things that happen in the Audible version that I find really kind of give me more perspective when I'm reading the comic as well. So I think that having them together works.
Yes.
I think that they both kind of reflect nicely on each other. But yeah, there are times where certain things do, reflect better or do work better in one medium than the other. And that's just kind of the way that it is. But I do find that, it's such a horrifying moment where we see this kid's dead face, and yet it is this incredibly loving moment.
Yeah.
That this is the story that we're telling. It's like the movie Shaun of the Dead is actually a romantic comedy. Like, if you think about what the story is actually about, it's a romantic comedy. It just happens to have zombies in it, and this is a love story that is also a ghost story. It has ghosts in it, but it is a love story. And especially when we're doing all of these, all of this has been about the dead are coming back, and hell has closed, and there are demons everywhere, and there's all of this stuff going on, that we remain connected to the love part of the story, I think is so powerful. And such an important, conscious choice to be made, that what is it that we're going to focus on? And that's one of the things that I love about fusing genres like that, is that when you mix love and death, and horror and all of that, and you mix it together, those flavors just really heighten each other, and it works so beautifully. I really love it.
Yeah, me too.
Even though it's got dead kids in it, which is always a problem for me. So, Elisa, what's your favorite page?
Oh, my favorite page. I think, going back to that page in the library where, Roland's reading The Scarlet Pimpernel, and we see those ghostly faces pressed up against the window panes. And then as Roland is reflecting on the sense of history in the school, giving him a haunting feeling, we see that the ghosts are now inside with him in the beds near him, but they're separated by a panel border. So we've got this, image of the room, which is very long, and it's separated. So it's like the conceit of the panel border shows that the ghosts are inside, but they're still a little separate from him. And yet we get that foreboding because we know they're drawing closer.
Right. And even when you're alone, you're not
alone.
I love, for me, I think it's the final page when they're walking away together into the sunlight and Payne throws his cap up and it ends up on that gate like a head on a spike. I love it. It's so incredibly powerful. And while we have, in the foreground is this cap on the, spiky gate, head on a pike. It is very, kind of reminiscent of the head on the pike, which is a horrifying image, right? Yet, combined with this very happy, two friends hand in hand walking into the sunlight. It is a bright and beautiful and hopeful day. And again, those flavors just elevate each other. I just think that visually that works so beautifully, and I absolutely love it. What's your favorite part of the story?
Oh, I think it's got to be when Roland, newly dead, just refuses to leave his one true friend. I don't think we've ever seen anyone else say no to death.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really wonderful. I love, again, like my favorite part and my favorite page happen to be the same this week because it's when they leave. They leave together, and they're off to have this. And, the last thing is, let's see what life has in store for us or something like that, right? Which I think is really interesting commentary on the life that continues even after death, because life is just time moving forward. And where are you going to go? What are you going to do? So I love that. I think it's great.
And I'm never going back to my old school. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, connect with the show on Twitter. Contact the law firm follow at Chipperish and use the hashtag #EndlessPodcast, or send your comments or questions to endless@chipperish.com.
This episode of Endless was brought to you by the Chipperish Media producers who support us on Patreon at the power producer level. These people are the reason why Endless is coming to you free and ad-free right now. So thank you to Abby, Alice, Christina, Erica, Jane, Kevin, Kristen, Michael, Rose, Sarah, Shelley, and Stephania. And this week's special message for our power producers: if you get bored, come up to the sand. I'll make you a cup of tea and we can have a bit of a natter.
To find out how you too can support Chipperish Media, visit patreon.com/Chipperish. Other ways to show your support: write a great review on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends about the show, or Manson, put that away. Just because I'm not looking doesn't mean that I can't see you.
This episode of Endless was edited by Chipperish content editor Jack Cram. Jack, you, live boy, clean yourself up. We'll be back next time with Season of Mist, Chapter 5, Issue 26 of the Sandman series, and the very first issue officially assistant edited by someone we all know very well. Until then, even when you're alone,
you're not alone.